I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking you through a slide deck which introduces you to the Creative PEC, who we are, what we do, how we go about doing our policy work, telling you a little bit about the research portfolio that the approach that we take to research and the different types of research we do in our portfolio. Maybe give you a taster of some of the policy impacts that we're intending to have and that we believe we have had in the past year. And then to finish off with a sense of our forward look for, highlights from our forward look in terms of our research programme. So hopefully there'll be plenty of time for questions and issues that I haven't covered. So if I could move over to the next slide. So this is an easy slide to present. What is the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre? So moving to the next slide, please. So the mission of the Centre is to support growth in the UK's creative industries through independent, authoritative research and policy advice. And if we go to the next slide, that sets out the vision if we're successful in pursuing our mission. So if all goes well, independent data, evidence and policy advice will be enabling the UK's creative industries to thrive, fueling growth, international influence, and helping to find innovative solutions to global challenges. Move to the next slide, please. So just by way of a potted history, we were founded in 2018 as a child of the then UK Industrial Strategy. So we were funded through the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. We were hosted at Nesta, which many of you will know is an independent research organisation based in London. And in that first phase, we published 46 research reports, 37 discussion papers, a large number of policy briefings and so forth. In 2023, after our first 5-year grant expired, we moved across to Newcastle University in partnership with the Royal Society of Arts, and I'll tell you a bit about that partnership shortly. And we moved from being funded through the Industrial Strategy onto the AHRC's baseline budget. And in this period, we shifted in the first phase of the PEC in 2018 to 2023, where our goal really was to achieve a step change in the evidence base for the creative industries. And then when we moved over in 23 to Newcastle, the emphasis changed to building a research infrastructure for policy and evidence in the creative industries. And that sort of quite significant shift, I think, will be apparent in the work we are now doing as compared with that first 5-year period. So if you can move forward to the next slide, please. So we describe our approach, our approach to sort of research-led policy development as embedded knowledge exchange. And as I'm seeing these slides on my phone, the font is remarkably small. So forgive me if if I'm straining my eyes to view the slides. But the idea of embedded knowledge exchange is that we hold we hold the hands of policymakers from end to end in what we call the policy process. So that means working closely with policymakers to identify research questions which emanate from their priorities. We then work closely with them on the design of the policies through to implementation and ultimately evaluation, monitoring, learning and evaluation of those policies, and the insights that we gain from the monitoring, learning and evaluation feeds back into policy in a virtuous cycle. And this schematic sets out who are our 3 key stakeholders, which is primarily policymakers, of course, but also academic researchers, other academic researchers and industry. And what the schematic shows is that ultimately the source of our research agenda is industry need. So we spend an awful lot of time talking to industry and getting an understanding of what research questions the creative industries need answering. We then feed back, but we also draw on resources from other academic research, of course, and insights from policymakers. And that sort of drives our research and policy agenda. And then the main outputs, of course, ultimately are policy recommendations, which we feed through to government. And as I say, government hopefully enacts those policies, which leads to more insights, which feeds back into our evidence base. And so that's the virtuous sort of cycle that we are operating within in our embedded knowledge exchange approach. It's worth saying that if you are genuinely going to hold the hands of policymakers from in the policy process, that's very human capital intensive. So it's a very, that's a downside. It's a very resource intensive exercise. But the benefit, of course, is that by this being embedded in the policy processes, we have very natural pathways to impact. And so, we have quite a high hit rate, I guess, in terms of our our research-led policy development. So if I could move over to the next slide, please. So although the embedded knowledge exchange approach is one of the constants actually in the Creative PEC since the beginning in 2018, one of the things that has changed is our structure. So in 2023, when we moved from Leicester to Newcastle, we adopted very purposefully a twin hub structure. So we now have the team distributed across two hubs, one in the north of England, the northeast of England at Newcastle University, and roughly half the team based in London at RSA House. The logic here really is in Creative PEC, the first 5-year grant from 2018 to 23, we really focused all our efforts on Westminster and on national policy. And we developed, as I say, this idea of embedded knowledge exchange. In moving to a twin hub structure, we're testing out very explicitly whether we can take this approach and embed it within local and regional policymaking processes. And so the idea is that, and this is obviously very timely given the devolutionary turn in industrial policy we've seen in the UK, indeed in public policy more generally. And the logic is that we're testing this model in the Northeast. And so if it succeeds, perhaps in the future there'll be a triple or indeed a quadruple hub. And this is the logic of the twin hub structure. If you can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I mentioned that one of the sort of quite subtle shifts in the PEC in this first phase of work to its current phase is that we are now really quite deliberately trying to build a research infrastructure or an R&D infrastructure, if you like, for policy and evidence in the creative industries. And one part of that is that we've been investing in the development of some new networks. And there are three that are primary networks that we are focusing on. First is our Creative PEC Research Fellows Network, which is supposed to be the global network of choice for researchers who are interested in the economics of the creative industries. And although in many cases that is economists, it's not, of course, uniquely so because there are many disciplines that have their own perspectives on the economics of the creative industries, and we try and pull together a multidisciplinary network of researchers. And it's a global network. We currently have, I think it's 64 strong. It's growing by the day. If you're interested in participating in this network, please reach out to us. But essentially, this is a mechanism for knowledge sharing between global experts on the economics of the creative industries. We have a very active webinar program, which hopefully some of you have attended and perhaps will present at in future webinars. And we've also distributed some small network grants, which we've currently got 4 live, which are individual research fellows or groups of research fellows running their own sort of sub-networks within our research fellows network, which is proving to be very interesting, actually. And we've got 4, as I say, that are currently live in topics as varied as urban development through to regulation of AI. And so that's the Global Research Fellows Network. We have a Global Creative Economy Council, which you can think of as being a global think tank, which is globally inclusive. So it's made up of 15 members currently, with strong representation across the global south as well as the global north. And it's a knowledge sharing platform, but critically, it's also a source of ideation for policies and particular multilateral policy issues, because we feel that actually even organizations like OECD and UN tend to have geographical biases. Whereas what we're trying to do with the GCEC, the Global Creative Economy Council, is to have a genuinely globally inclusive discussion on issues which policy issues which by their design by their nature require multilateral action. Issues such as environmental sustainability. I mentioned regulation of AI, which of course is a multilateral agenda, and other issues like sustainable development and sustainable economic development. And so these are all areas where which sort of occupy which are the focus of the GCEC. And then last but not least, the Creative PEC Industry Champions Network. We currently have over 50 of the industry champions. These are domain experts, HR experts working in visual effects companies, freelance designers working in theatre. The idea is that this is a network of domain experts rather than C-suite execs who we can call on to ask for very granular insights in terms of what their policy needs are, and indeed what policy interventions are needed to support their work. So we can move to the next slide, please. So our research portfolio, I mean, we do an awful lot of research and there are broadly four sort of buckets I put that within. First of all, we have our flagship State of the Nations reporting series. The logic of these State of the Nations is that in key areas, 4 areas that we've identified, we believe that, and we're trying to signal to policymakers, that the quantitative evidence base is sufficiently strong to produce regular reporting, set piece affairs. We're programmed well in advance, so policymakers know exactly what they're expecting. We consult them very heavily on the content of those reports. But the idea is that it's a longitudinal initiative. We want to basically update key data sets over time and indicators over time. And the logic of this is that in these 4 areas, at least, which I'll go on to talk about, in these 4 areas, policymakers can no longer use the absence of data or the perceived absence of data as an excuse for policy inaction. And so that's the State of the Nations reporting series. We have a Creative Business Panel, which is another longitudinal data initiative. It's a business panel survey that we've constructed to survey creative industries over coming years on a regular basis, to ask them a range of questions around their investment behaviours and investments in skills, R&D and innovation, etc., as well as key questions on their business performance. And the idea being that if we can construct a longitudinal data set, we may really for the first time be able to do some causal analysis, which relates to which allows us to identify the impact of various investment behaviours on business performance. So that's the CBP, and we've just piloted that survey. And after the Easter, we'll be publishing the findings from that pilot survey. We do in-house research, which speaks for itself. We have a small research unit which does its own, undertakes its own research, either funded through our AHRC grant or externally funded through external research commissions. We typically don't bid for contract research, but we do sometimes take grants from funders like DCMS, AHRC, etc., Arts Council England, if it aligns with research that we really want to do and we feel it needs to be done. And then last but not least, co-commissioned research or commissioned research. So we have a fairly chunky research budget set aside to address research priorities where expertise is needed that we do not have in the research unit or in the wider research consortium. Or we may have the research skills, but we don't have the time to address research in a timely way. And so we make use of our commissioned funds. And as a principle, whenever we commission research, I try and co-commission, because invariably there are strategic partners, research funders, who have the same interests as ours in certain areas. And we try and double up our resources and also double up our research management capacity by partnering with organisations. Go to the next slide, please. So the State of the Nations reporting, I mentioned, these are our flagship series in many ways. We work in 4 areas that I mentioned: R&D and innovation clusters, creative education, skills and talent, internationalisation, by which I mean trade, foreign direct investment, migration, and last but not least, the arts, culture and heritage subsectors, which it's a slightly clumsy title, but we've identified the arts and cultural heritage subsectors as worthy of particular attention because of the distinctive role they play within the UK's creative industries. And so these are our 4 areas, and the logos of the organisations below are this is where the research consortium comes in. We essentially partner with 4 research partners to produce the State of the Nations reporting, but it's very much a collaboration, very much working closely with the partners. Next slide, please. So I mentioned commissioned research. Occasionally we take research grants to do our own research in-house that's not funded by our PEC grant, and these are some of the organisations we've worked with in the last couple of years. So hopefully it gives you a good sense of the spread. Next slide, the policy impact. So we think of us intending to achieve policy impacts in 3 broad ways. Firstly, the rather lofty ambition of improving the whole evidence ecosystem, which, as I said, it aligns with our ambitions to be a part, to build a research infrastructure for creative industries. And so a good example of that is indeed our State of the Nation programmes. If you view those as a whole, they're a major longitudinal effort. We'll be publishing, I think, over 30 reports over 5 years, and we hope will be the most significant longitudinal evidence base there is for the creative industries globally. And that's the State of the Nations programme as an example. Changing the policy or conversation is another way, getting policymakers to ask new questions, phrase issues in new minds. Creative clusters actually is a concept we all take for granted, of course, but actually was back in 2009 at Nesta, where we produced our first mapping of the UK's creative clusters. And there's actually been a very long game we've been playing, I suppose, and a long clusters turn in policy that we've been working towards. And so creative clusters I pick as one example, as where over the long term we've changed the policy conversation. Not uniquely, of course, there's been other key stakeholders involved as well, but that's been a driving force for us. And then last but not least, most obviously, we want to achieve policy impact by affecting specific policy change. So we make an awful lot of recommendations through policy briefings and other reports over the years, and we prioritise some for campaigning efforts. And these are very specific initiatives. And the example I've given here is the Standard Industrial Classification 2026, which is in near final form, being published by the ONS, and that's making some very significant changes to give better high resolution capture of the creative industries in the official statistics, and including a 4-digit SIC code for video games development, which is something that personally I've been sort of campaigning for about 15 years. So it's good to see that. The next slide, please. Just very briefly, actually, just to leave some time for questions, but one example of a national policy impact we believe we have had at the national level is the Creative Industry Sector Plan that many of you will know was published in June last year. I won't go through bullet by bullet the slide, but it sort of sets out the different ways in which we engage with policymakers, holding their hands, as I say, from end to end in the process. Creative Industry Force, we held a number of policy roundtables bringing together industry and policymakers, and we did a fair bit of responsive research as well. In the end, we ended up with 20 unique pieces of research cited in the sector plan. I think it was like 15% of the references were to Creative PEC research, and contributed to some flagship commitments to increase UKRI spend in creative industries, and investment by the British Business Bank, and amongst a number of other issues. Lastly, I put a bullet point here, was gaining national support for the idea of investing in creative corridors, which takes me to the next slide, which I've given as an example of our impact at a local level. So in 2023, with Andy Haldane at the Royal Society of Arts, we sort of suggested or proposed that the concept of creative corridors could be a useful support for a useful concept for understanding priorities for local economic development and place-based development. This is the basic idea that neighbouring and adjacent clusters can in key strategic ways join up and coordinate to achieve some of the benefits that superclusters like Manchester and London have. And so this is the idea behind the creative corridors. And in practice, it was the north of England that moved the quickest. So there are initiative what called One Creative North, which is 5 of the northern mayors have come together, are investing in coordinating in very concrete ways in areas like skills and financial investment. And we've just begun a project, I think it's just been announced fairly recently, working with stakeholders in the central south of England, which will of course include Bournemouth, to explore whether there can be a meaningful creative corridor can be supported within that region. So that's an example of our local impact I've given. Can you go to the next slide, please? So research. I wanted to just spend 2 or 3 slides giving you a taster of what the nature of our research is for those that aren't familiar with it. And I picked a report which is one of our most recent, which is an attempt to map the UK's landscape of high growth potential creative industries firms. And of course, for those of you that do follow industrial policy and industrial strategy and the sector plan from last year, you'll know that economic growth is the primary focus of the UK government. And this is an attempt to map high growth potential firms in the creative industries. And this was a collaboration with the private company data provider Bohurst, which collates and curates data sources from a multiple range of sources, and we use that data for this study. And what we do is the report defines and maps the population in the UK of high growth potential firms and describes their geography. It compares and contrasts these high growth potential firms with their counterparts in life sciences and advanced manufacturing, which are 2 of the other 8 sort of priority sectors that make up the industrial strategy. The report quantifies how high growth potential firms are supported in the UK innovation system, including detailed data on equity and debt funding history. And then last but not least, and the reason for doing this work is it provides an evidence base which helps make creative industries more visible to investors, which is a big policy priority that was identified in the sector plan. can go to the next slide, please. So this just quickly gives you a taster of the geography of the high growth potential firms in the creative industries that we defined. Yeah, I think that sort of speaks for itself, but hopefully this sort of data, based as it is on open data sources, can be a very practical help for agencies that are interested in local economic development. You can move to the next slide. And sort of a final insight that I just wanted to illustrate from this report. What we did was we used the fact that companies at Companies House can select up to 4 SIC codes when they register their company to do a network analysis between the subsectors of the creative industries. And the idea here is that one of the key findings in here is that software, which of course we all know is the biggest subsector within the creative industries, controversially so, but as well as being the biggest, it's the big number 3 here, it's the biggest node within the creative industries subsector network. It also has the highest network centrality, which is a new insight. What that basically means is that large numbers of businesses that are working in application software are working in other creative subsectors like advertising and film and TV, graphic design too. And so we believe this is quite an important insight which tries to shift the creative industries discourse away from thinking of individual subsectors, some being more important than the others based on their GVA, to actually thinking of them as an ecosystem or a network of firms that are operating in different sectors, at least when it comes to the high growth potential firms subsector segment of the creative industries. Can we move to the next slide, please? So I think I'm coming to the end now, just to finish with 2 last slides to give you a taste of some of the highlights from our forward research plan. So our next 4 State of the Nations are going to be out within the next 6 months. We've actually got 5 coming out in the next 6 months. We're looking at management practices in the creative industries using the longitudinal small business survey, the management expectation survey, and the UK employer skills survey to paint a detailed picture of management practices, strengths and weaknesses, perceived weaknesses in the creative industries. We're doing an update of our Geographies of Creativity report, State of the Nation, which we published in 2023, just to see in recent years, has there been any change in the picture? Some of you will know that there's been talk about sometimes described as a Northern Revolution, as some of the historical inequities in regional development, it is argued, have been closed. Well, we're going to be looking at that and probing that assertion in this report. It's being published in May. We're doing our next Arts, Culture and Heritage State of the Nation on Scotland, using data sources like the Scottish Household Survey and the Scottish Census to paint a picture of participation and workforce, the workforce in those subsectors. And then last but not least, on internationalisation, we're planning to do a study on services trade restrictiveness in July. I've already mentioned that we're going to be publishing the pilot findings from our CBP, the Creative Business Panel, and that'll be after Easter. And the last slide, just to give you some other highlights. Of course, if you're interested in any of this work, you can ask me about it now, or offline later, you can drop me a line and I'm happy to tell you more. But we've got a number of interesting research projects underway. I won't go through all of these, just to draw your attention to a couple of them. On May the 12th, we're launching a very major study, which is the Creative Industry Skills Audits, which is a very detailed look at the skills needs of individual subsectors making up the creative industries. So we've got 11 reports directed at 11 subsectors with an overarching sort of CI-wide skills audit assessment, looking at a very detailed look at employer demand. We're doing we've conducted a new survey of the self-employed in the creative industries. That's actually been done in partnership with the Centre for Economic Performance, Steve Machin at the LSE. And the idea there is to collect detailed survey data on the characteristics and needs and preferences of the creative self-employed workforce. But critically, we've collected data from the self-employed and the rest of the workforce too, so we can benchmark the creative self-employed workforce with the rest of the workforce. So that's look out for the insights on that. An area which, of course, is going to be of big interest to colleagues at Bournemouth is AI, IP, and regulation. We've got a number of reports underway. We're doing an international landscape review of regulation and case law on AI and copyright. We've conducted a behavioural experiment looking at whether the public perceives AI-assisted works as worthy of copyright or not. And last but not least, we're just in the early stages of a choice experiment, which is looking at authors' preferences for licenses for their work to be trained for AI purposes. So hopefully that gives you a whistle-stop tour of what we do, why we do it, what we're hoping to achieve, and what we've got coming up next. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very
Sorry,
much.
that took a bit longer
Are we
than I
back?
intended. Sorry about that.
Are we back to normal there? No, I don't think I've stopped sharing.
There we go.
There we go. We're back to normal. Thank you very, very much, Hasan, for that massive amount of information and for getting through it so efficiently so that we've actually got some time for questions. Colleagues, does anybody want to kick us off? We've got any burning questions? I'm looking at the screen. Not yes. I was going to say otherwise I would. Rupert.
Hi.
Hey.
So great presentation, Hasan. Thank you. I'm from Film and TV Charity, though I have an association with Bournemouth as well. So I'm coming at this from two perspectives. I'm just interested in. I understood that well-being is a kind of cross-cutting theme for the work that you do, and I just wondered how that figures, because obviously a lot of the work that we do from a research perspective is through a lens of mental health, physical well-being, social well-being, and financial well-being, particularly with a view on the emphasis on growth in CRISP and other documents. I mean, we're seeing a lot of evidence of the jeopardy of the workforce, and again, that's another vector we come at it from. So I'm just really interested in understanding how you understand well-being as a cross-cutting theme in your work.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, actually, the two cross-cutting themes we've identified in our research, sorry, I sort of skipped through the slides quite quickly, but are actually broadly EDI and sustainability. And of course, well-being sort of goes to the heart of both of those. I mean, in terms of what we've done on well-being, we've got a sort of tenure track research fellow at Newcastle University who's a part of the team whose expertise is in subjective well-being. And there are a couple of reports underway where she's looking at cultural participation, both active and passive forms, and the impact that has on well-being. And we're also obviously interested in thinking about putting a well-being lens on sustainability and sustainable practices at work. But it's fair to say, though, rightly or wrongly, most of the emphasis that we tend to place is still because of the government's emphasis on growth. But it's a tension, right? Because when it comes to workplace in particular, many of the, arguably there's some trade-offs which sort of lead into deleterious impacts on well-being, right? Which are practices which are supportive of growth. So I think I think we're well aware of the tensions, and certainly in our labour market strand, we do an awful lot of work on good work. You may be familiar with the good work review that we conducted. But in terms of the lens of well-being as an evaluation measure, it's fair to say that it's not really cross-cutting in terms of the work we do. It's more of a theme that we're pursuing in particular research projects. But in the main, we do work within a more of a neoclassical, I suppose, economic framework, rightly or wrongly.
Okay, no, that's really interesting. I mean, I suppose that the takeaway for me is that it's not just their intention; it's that if people are hemorrhaging or potentially hemorrhaging out of the industry, it does put the kind of growth agenda at major risk.
Yeah, I think it's a big challenge. It's the elephant in the room with the growth, with the sector plan, right? Because there's a big focus on economic growth, but actually, the impacts on well-being, are critical to understanding how sustainable that growth will be. And so I think it's a fair elephant in the room. It's something we definitely want to address in our work going forward.
Can I ask on that, sort of staying on that issue of high growth? I was very interested. You mentioned in passing, sort of comparing and contrasting the creative industries. High growth potential firms with those in other areas like life sciences, and I wondered what headline differences were, if they're headlineable. Not too complex.
Yeah, there are. I think, as you'd expect in a comprehensive mapping study of this kind, some of the interesting findings were about how similar actually the subsectors were, because there's often a tendency within the creative industries, partly because the evidence base is very insular and focused on the creative industry. There tends to be an exceptionalism bias. So one area where actually the results were staggeringly similar was in terms of the nature of equity funding and debt funding histories, particularly equity funding. Actually, with debt funding, you'd expect you do find that the creative industries at all stages in the life cycle struggle more than their life sciences and advanced manufacturing counterparts, particularly manufacturing, to get debt financing. But the numbers are small in all cases at the late stage, right? So all subsectors basically struggle to access finance. It's not just the creative industries. And with equity funding in particular, actually, I mean, at the aggregate level, it turns out the creative industries have had more equity funding than the other subsectors, right? And the average size, so more companies have had equity funding, sorry. The average size of equity funding they raise is, of course, smaller because creative industry firms are smaller on average. But in terms of sheer numbers, you know, there are lots of firms out there who are securing equity. Of course, they're heavily geographically distributed and concentrated in the south. And so in certain parts, you've certainly got equity cold spots in certain parts of the country. But I guess that's one area where actually the differences weren't so great with the other sectors. In other areas, as I say, firm size, and creative industries are smaller firms, basically, which means that the equity they raise at a firm level is smaller, is a difference. And other areas, we looked at other aspects of the innovation system. So as well as equity and debt funding, we looked at whether firms had been through accelerators or whether they'd got innovation grants from the likes of Innovate UK and Arts Council England. With accelerators, interestingly, very, very little difference. You know, creative industries are well supported by accelerators, as well as actually the other subsectors. But when it comes to innovation grants, as you'd expect, much, much less support. So far, far fewer proportionately creative industries firms in the high growth segment secure innovation grants compared with their life science and advanced manufacturing counterparts. I think we'd all expect that, right? Because these grants have traditionally been set for large firms that have got the capacity to apply for grants and have got the absorptive capacity to work with these grants. But it's still interesting to see the numbers, and the numbers are big, right? So this is notwithstanding the massive efforts AHRC and Innovate have made to move towards creative industries in recent years. The statistics show that the disparities are still huge.
Is that partly because those grants tend to focus a lot on material innovation in the sense of, you know, the technologies, whereas notwithstanding, you know, AI, virtual production, everything else, the efforts of the creative industries tend to be on human capital at the end of the day?
Yeah, I mean, we can only speculate because the study doesn't give explanations for why. It's really a mapping study, but I think that's very intuitive. I think that's part of the picture, and I think it's a combination. I'd speculate, right? But it's partly what you've just said, you know, that the programs themselves historically have not really been fit for purpose for creative industries R&D, right? And so, but there has been significant changes. We know, particularly the AHRC has made massive efforts to sort of move, you know, things like the clusters program. You know, there have been much more SME focused R&D grants coming from the AHRC and Innovate UK. It's partly that, but I think it's also partly absorptive capacity, you know, because firms are small. I mean, you know, micro businesses would really struggle to engage, right, with grants because they have to apply. And when you win a grant, right, you've actually got to deliver on a grant, and that's very demanding. So I think it's probably a mixture of those sorts of reasons.
Any other questions, folks? I can sit here and dominate this if nobody else has one. Just little sort of curiosity, Hasan. I think interesting to see the new version of the SICs. Do you have the SOCs in your sights for the next one? I'm thinking about some of the sort of census data that's so hopeless around the creative industries.
So SOC 2020 has not yet been reflected in the DCMS statistics, of course, right? So the employment estimates you get from DCMS are still using SOC 2010. So DCMS is partly through the sector plan, we made a case for more data to be made available, right? That was one of our sort of wins, I guess, within the sector plan process, was a commitment to expand the number of statistics that are available on a more timely basis on the creative industries. So we will see some employment estimates using SOC soon. So in addition to the creative industries estimates which use SIC, we'll see some creative occupations estimates, but they'll be using SOC 2020 for the first time. But as you say, ONS actually just has very recently, a few weeks ago, and issued its first consultation for the next SOC 2030. So it's actually very live at the moment. There's a deadline, I think, of mid-May for those who are interested, or possibly June. You have to check the dates for submission deadlines of the ONS's welcoming responses. Historically, SOC has actually been a lot better than SIC, you know, when it comes to the creative industries. So I think generally speaking, I'm not alone in thinking that we feel a bit more comfortable talking about the creative workforce in SOC terms. The SIC codes have really been problematic, right? I mean, it's crazy that it's 2025, 2026, and we still don't have a code for games development. I mean, it's crazy. And so I think that the SIC is a bigger issue. Census data obviously is very interesting because it's because of the scale, right? It's a census rather than a sample survey. And so although it's irregular, it's a very important data source, right, for giving a granular picture. And we've, for example, colleagues in the PEC last year or the year before used the last census data, Census 2021 data, to paint a picture of the geography of freelance employment in the creative workforce, which I think goes down to a local authority level. And I think we've got a dashboard that was published alongside that for people to use the data and interrogate it. But the census is a very important source of data for sure.
Helen. Hi.
Hi. Well, just on the back of your other question, Krista, about these high growth potential firms, and this is a bit of a general question, but also a selfish question. I mean, under trying to develop these high growth potential firms in the creative industries, there's a kind of big encouragement for a kind of triple helix approach to this, that the universities can add value with industry, with combined authorities. And I wonder what one of the issues is that a lot of these companies are small SMEs. They're not like advanced manufacturing or health and life sciences. They haven't applied for lots of Innovate UK grants. So where is it, do you think, universities can make the most difference then in this triple helix approach? Because we're looking at what happens in other sectors, and we're not entirely sure, I don't think, about how to map that across.
Yeah, it's obviously a very big challenge, but it's really important for those of us, as you say, working in universities. I think a couple of things I would say. It's not a complete answer, but a couple of things I would say. The first thing is that any attempt to do collaborative R&D, if you're in a university, must start from a clear understanding of what's distinctive about R&D processes in the creative industries, because the evidence suggests it's growing. It's not a huge evidence base, but it's certainly growing. The evidence suggests that there are very distinctive features of R&D in the creative industries that must be understood if you're going to work on R&D in a collaborative way with businesses. So, for example, we know from our own survey work that R&D is much more of a distributed function within creative industries firms compared with, say, life sciences firms. So where in a life sciences firm, you may have an R&D unit where all the R&D personnel are working with R&D in their job titles in ways that you can easily identify and budget for. In our R&D, we know in creative industries firms it's much more distributed. So it's a function that's not specialized within one unit typically, particularly in small creative industries firms, but it's actually a function, I guess, of many roles, right? And that's really, really important, because what that suggests is if you're a university that wants to work with a business, it's not a simple case of working out who the R&D person is. And actually, you've got to think of a way of actually engaging with the whole firm, which isn't easy, but it's just a reality of R&D. The other thing is budgeting. One other thing that's emerged from 2 or 3 surveys, including some of our own work, is that R&D creative industries firms typically tend not to budget for R&D, and that's unfortunate for all sorts of reasons. It's certainly unfortunate if you want to engage with the tax relief system, if you're not actually budgeting for R&D and not accounting for it. That's actually something where I think creative industries firms need to go on a bit of a journey, and they may need some support. They need to be able to think about their R&D more purposefully, because these are ruthlessly competitive markets most creative industries firms are engaging in, and they need to sort of professionalize their innovation in a way they may not naturally do. And so that's another area, I think, where universities themselves can hold the hands of businesses. And so these another example I'd give of an insight that's emerging quite clearly from a number of studies is that interdisciplinary R&D, so R&D which draws off different academic disciplinary domains, is more important in the creative industries than other sectors. And again, that needs to be understood if you're going to begin an engagement program with firms, right? You need to know what their research needs actually are, because they may not be typically what you think of as an R&D research need. And incidentally, as an aside, in the sector plan, one of the things I was most pleased with was a commitment to HMRC to publish new guidance for prospective applicants from creative industries for R&D tax relief. And the big focus there, and I worked since the sector plan with HMRC to write that guidance, and it was published in January this year. But that's primarily acknowledging interdisciplinary R&D. It's for the first time HMRC is explicitly acknowledging that some arts activities are an intrinsic and inherent and essential part of interdisciplinary R&D efforts within the creative industries, and you can't sort of siphon off technology, put in a silo technological R&D and arts R&D. They're one and the same thing. And there's some case studies we gave, it's illustrative case examples. But I think these are all examples. The lack of budgeting for R&D, the distributed nature of R&D within organisations, and the importance of interdisciplinary R&D. These are all features which you need to start from if you're going to be building programs, right? Then when it comes to a bit more prosaically about how do you actually work with businesses, of course, we do have some experiments, live experiments like the AHRC's clusters program, and there clearly have been some examples. I know in Cardiff, for example, there's been a very successful small R&D grants program, and in Edinburgh, likewise, in the first clusters wave for the clusters program. And I think we can all learn from that in terms of practical, concrete mechanisms by which, small businesses can be engaged with, because some things appear to have worked.
John. Yeah.
Hello, everyone.
Hello,
John here. Hello, Hasan. It's very nice to see you. And by the way, I should just declare myself that I'm a independent consultant, work across cultural and creative industries. I know the work of Hasan and the PEC very well. Well, first of all, congratulations, Hasan. I mean, I don't know what other colleagues feel on the call. The PEC looks stronger than ever. And I've really noticed, particularly the work you've got coming on AI. I know so many anxious creative industries and cultural industries, people that work across writing for a living, and it feels like an emergency klaxon. But and it's also true to say that it's unimaginable to think of creative industries policymaking in this country without the PEC. The work that happened under Nesta and now, and I don't think that's said enough. But anyway, let's say it now. I want to make you a very important person, Hasan. Here's my question. I was thinking as you were talking, no one knows more about the creative industries or the interaction between the cultural industries and creative industries, those interdependencies. And so I'm going to make you the chief exec of a public investment bank, which has got 750 million to start with. We're just going to give you 750 million. And your brief is to think about where you would start investing in a way that both scales the success and sustainability of our creative industries, but does so in a way which creates positive synergies and interdependencies and support with cultural industries. I think we may have heard one of your answers in the last question, which is you probably be looking at ways to embed R&D. But I'm just, probably what sits behind the question, Hasan, is that so often I feel like the brilliant work that you and other colleagues on this call do sometimes is that they get siloed into narrower debates rather than interventions that are systemic and can change the whole environment. And I think that's why I'm asking you. So you're the chief exec of our new public investment bank in creative industries. You've got 750 million. I'm just interested if you just know immediately where your big bets would be. I'm not asking you to apportion the money. That would be too unkind with 13 minutes to go on a call. But do you immediately have an instinct of what your first round of big bets might be if you had that money to make that difference?
I don't have an easy answer to that. It's a really difficult question, right? Because there's at least two levels in which one needs to answer that, right? If the objective is economic growth, innovation, productivity growth, you want to target high growth potential firms. And that's in essence what Innovate. I don't know if you've read Innovate UK's recent prospectus they published at the end of last week. Superb, but it's basically saying it's really very, very good in terms of a public policy, a public document. It's one of the best I've seen, and it's actually mercifully short and succinct and to the point. But essentially, what it's making the case is that if the UK is going to grow, the UK is very good at ideation, creativity, creating IP. It is argued more generally creating innovation, patents, very strong on patents. But when it comes to actually exploiting that for commercial purposes and growing, scale businesses, we're weaker. Now, that's obviously something we all known. And that's, if you are serious about addressing economic growth in industrial strategy, you've got to start from that basis, right? And that applies to the creative industries just as it does with any other subsector, any other sector. So I think this is one of the reasons why we were quite keen on this high growth potential firms report. It's just one way. I mean, the report is largely about how you actually define such a thing, right? Which is absolutely fascinating to try and actually operationalize the definition. But whichever way you define it, that's got to be the place to start. So on one level, the answer is prioritize growth potential firms. But, and this is my second thing, and it's a big qualifier to what I've just said, which is that high growth firms emerge from an ecosystem, right? A wider ecosystem, which supports the ideation that gives rise to great innovative high growth businesses. It's a system which basically provides finance for businesses at the right stages on their journeys. It's a system that has a talent and education system that provides skilled labour to actually man, because creative industries, if nothing else, we know they're very human capital intensive, right? That's why they're big employers, right? Because it's human talent is needed. And so there are many. You need an intellectual property framework which incentivizes creatives and actually creates the value added and push it, and you need a system to recycle that value added back into the creative industries to sort of sustain that growth. So you need an ecosystem as well as high growth businesses, and that's the second level of my answer is that you need to invest in the wider ecosystem, and it's complicated because it's an answer. You have to invest in lots of things, but unfortunately, that's the reality. That's the world we live in. And actually, the Creative PEC, I do feel myself, is an aspect of that ecosystem, right? It's an attempt to create a centre who is charged with building an infrastructure. It's a very lofty ambition, but we're doing it because that system needs a research infrastructure. And actually, even in recent years, with the growth of creative industries research, we're seeing a massive fragmentation. We've not published the findings of a bibliometric analysis I'm doing at the moment of the creative industry research field. And what you're unsurprisingly finding is the literature is growing massively, but it's fragmenting. It's fragmenting into disciplinary silos and geographical silos, and there's some coordination needed. The system needs to, the infrastructure needs a coordinating mechanism, and I think the PEC is a part of that. And we unashamedly look at the creative industries as a whole. The challenge, of course, is to give insights which are granular enough to apply to individual subsectors, and that's why projects like our skills audits are so important, right? We're producing 20-page reports for individual subsectors, giving very detailed insights on their skills needs and shortages, but we do need a centre which can step above all of that, frankly, and look at the system as a whole. And that's really what the PEC's value proposition is. So if it's not too self-serving, John, I'd say some of that 750 million, I'd support the PEC to do its work, because I think I'm well aware of all the colleagues that are working research in this area, but I do feel we have a particular place within the UK's ecosystem for the creative industries.
Hasan, you won't surprise me to hear that. I agree, and actually one of the things that I think is so powerful in your answer is we need system leadership, right? We need some effective system leadership, for those of you that know that notion well. We don't actually have it. And so I think you're right in that respect, and you're right to direct us to have the complexity of those ecosystem links to the wider output of more high growth firms who are getting more capital and creating more growth and ideas. So, I mean, I also, the context of my question as well was, I wrote something about the Hodge review last week, which was quite bracing.
Wonderfully provocative. Fantastic.
But one of the things that I think is becoming a distraction is cultural devo. A broader froth around the devolution issue more generally. And my work across the country doing cultural strategies suggests to me that that whole debate is woefully underthought through. It's going to be rife with unintended consequences. And it's well-meaning, by the way, it's one of those love, peace and democracy concepts, right? Who could be against more, to a degree, local devolution that gives a whole range of people more voices about the allocation of resource in the area? It seems right. Actually, I think it's quite dangerous at the moment, in the context of, I think we haven't thought some of this through around the relationship between the wider cultural ecosystem and the creative industries ecosystem. And that's another example for system leadership. The PEC is always very well placed, if requested, to make responses around that if they were asked, or if you choose to make interventions. But thanks, Hasan. Thanks for the answer.
No, thanks for the question and for your positive feedback on our work. Thanks, John.
I would say one thing about this idea of the fragmentation, which I completely recognise, and the disciplinary fragmentation at an academic level as well becomes actually quite difficult to parse because of the methodological differences. When you start venturing into the journals that belong to other disciplines, and you suddenly come up against an entirely different sort of Yeah, it's quite problematic actually.
Very
So
much so.
yeah, I'm co-editing a special issue at the moment, which sits within a journal which comes from a business studies sort of perspective.
Right.
And you've got people who come from creative disciplines writing about their industries within it. And then there's a real tension because they just don't come from the right direction, you know. So you end up with that fragmentation can't sort of sort itself out because everyone's talking different languages. It's a sort of Babel situation with academia, I think, in that.
I think that makes a lot of sense. It's often, you know, the words multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary are often elided, but actually what most of the work I see is multidisciplinary. There's very little interdisciplinary work. And actually that was one of the joys being at Nesta many years ago, was that it was an organization set up to look at the science, technology, arts in an interdisciplinary way. So at its best, it wasn't always at its best, but at its best, it was doing genuinely interdisciplinary work. And I miss that because it's very, very difficult to do, actually.
Yeah. James, you've been sitting there patiently.
Thanks, Krista, and thanks, Hasan, as well. I wanted to ask you about where you think the conversation around creative clusters might be going. I mean, you mentioned on the slides about it's one of the sort of main thrusts that the PEC has sort of pushed that kind of policy conversation. I know the PEC has published work on rural microclusters, coastal clusters, urban microclusters, in addition to what you mentioned about creative corridors as well. And I was just wondering, I mean, is there anything that you think is still sort of underexplored or another dimension to the kind of clusters conversation that could be sort of coming down the pipe? Or so just where we are with that kind of complete debate, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot I could say on that, but I think one of the areas I'd point to is it's actually revisiting some work that we did at Nesta a few years ago, but for various reasons, it sort of we haven't picked up that thread for a while. Is using novel sources of data to look at the ecosystem in which clusters operate, because actually partly down to the work we did, but there's been an excessive focus on agglomeration economies and actually a tendency to measure what can be easily measured. Even business location isn't easily measured, and certainly, of course, because of things like headquarter effects. It's actually very, very difficult to establish where business is generally taking place. But I think some of those ecosystems, the networks. I mean, you know, clusters are about networks, right? They're not about individual firms or households. It's the relationships between those units. But official data doesn't measure relationships, right? It measures households, firms, historically, if you look at Office for National Statistics data. So we did many years ago at Nesta sort of experiment with novel data sources to try and look at those ecosystems. We used Meetup data. I remember years ago when meetup.com was a very popular site for looking at the nature of collaborations. And we charted, for example, hidden clusters, you know, so connectivities between adjacent clusters where you couldn't see it in the administrative boundaries, but actually there was a lot of knowledge sharing taking place because individuals were going to the same meetups. Now, with COVID, etc., that particular platform and the data, you know, generally speaking, a lot of the data that was available, I'm finding 10, 15 years ago, has been closed up, right? Because of the, not, you know, people's appreciation of the value of data, right? It's actually more difficult now to get data in many ways than it was years ago. But I think in terms of research, I think mapping ecosystems, moving beyond agglomeration economies to looking at novel sources of data. One particular piece of data set which is being mined by many academics, of course, but and we're no exception, is the UK's Gateway to Research data, which is UKRI's grants data. We've got a study underway. We've actually just haven't had time to sort of finish it off, but it's in good part done, looking at collaborative networks, so looking at the connections that, you know, how universities are located in collaboration space. You know, if you've got two universities in different parts of the country, but lots of academics are working together on the same project, they're in some sense close together in collaboration space. Again, that's hidden from traditional official statistics. So that's one sort of source of data. I think the other brief thing I was saying, clusters, is more policy in terms of the next new directions for policy. It's really interesting that the AHRC, when they published their R&D strategy for the creative industries, they called it the R&D strategy for cultural and the creative and cultural economy. And that was a very purposeful thing, right? I mean, what they're getting at there is they're acknowledging that the agenda might be more than just about what's at stake isn't just the individual subsectors making up the creative industries, but it's the wider innovation system that they occupy, right? And their links with other subsectors outside those industries. And also the creative and cultural is really interesting as well, right? Because John was alluding to this earlier. We still have remarkably little evidence on the role of the cultural sector and the interaction between the culture and wider creative industries. I'm forever asked about spillovers, evidence on cultural spillovers. And I find myself citing papers that I sort of was involved with 10, 15 years ago. There's actually remarkably little. It's very challenging to do to get at the causal relationship, of course, between causal culture and creative industries, because they both tend to be, vibrant cultural sectors tend to be places where vibrant creative industries, because they have underlying factors which are determining both. But so causal relationships are difficult to unpick, but there's much, much more that can be done. And even mapping the complexity has not really been done. So I think this idea of looking beyond creative industries clusters, but looking more at subsectoral connections, connections even with the IS8, the other IS8 industrial strategy 8 sectors, I think that's going to be a big expectation from policy, that's where we should go next.
Thank you, Hasan, for that very detailed answer. I'd happily do another hour of this, but it's not actually possible. So we are unfortunately going to have to finish our discussion because it's 2 o'clock. Really appreciate you coming along to join us today, Hasan. Thank you ever so much. Absolutely fascinating. Loads of interesting things to follow up on from me, at least. Thank you everybody else for joining us. Little plug of our next and entirely different CEMP talk, which is about practice research from Neil Fox at Falmouth. And in the meantime, enjoy the sunshine. Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much, Krista. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.